I have always loved back to school time. Um, I'm admittedly a bit of a nerd personally, but I loved going back to school. I loved everything about it. School supplies, getting to see my old friends again, getting into the study of it. And when I've become a pastor, back to school Sunday has always been one of my favorite Sundays in the life of the church. We're going to have the kids come down here in a little while, and we're going to bless their backpacks, and we're going to bless all those who are involved in educating our children, and to cap it off at the 11 o'clock service with a baptism. Well, that's pretty special. One interesting aspect of the Gospels is that they tell us very little about Jesus before the beginning of his public ministry at the age of 30. The Gospels tell us very little about his childhood. They tell us absolutely nothing about his teenage years and nothing about his young adulthood, what we would call young adulthood, his early 20s. Three of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, give us a little bit of introductory material. It varies from among each of those three Gospels. But then they begin their story of Jesus per se with his baptism by John in the River Jordan. In fact, of all the material in the Gospels, it's only Luke who tells us anything about Jesus' childhood. Luke, of course, gives us the great birth narrative that we read every year on Christmas Eve. It's one of my favorite stories in the entire canon. Luke tells us about the presentation of Jesus in the temple at 40 days old in accordance with the law of Moses. And then Luke gives us just a few verses and one story about the life of Jesus. It's all we get from the time he's 40 days old until the time he's 30 years old. And that passage is going to be our reading for today. It's from Luke's Gospel, chapter 2. I'm going to read right now verses 39 to 42, and then I'll come back and read a little bit more after that. Listen, friends, for the word of God as it is proclaimed by God's servant, the evangelist Luke. When they, that's Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, when Mary and Joseph had finished everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now every year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. And we'll come back to that story a little bit later. Those few verses summarize the time from Jesus' 40th day of life until he's 12. That's on my mind this week, especially because my own oldest son, Max, is 12. If we were trying to summarize his life to this point, we'd use a lot more than those few verses. And it's got me thinking about parenthood and childhood in the 21st century and the raising of kids to be faithful. Now, most parents of 12-year-olds these days come from primarily two generations. There are some baby boomers who have 12-year-olds, but that's the exception. Most parents of 12-year-olds are either from Gen X or they're millennials. So my wife and I are Gen X, and then the generation after us is age 23 to 38 now, roughly, and those are the millennials. And my experience in that peer group is that we share some common values when it comes to raising our kids. Now, I'm only speaking of my own experience, which means that I'm talking about middle to upper middle class parents raising their kids in the suburbs like Plano and Frisco, McKinney, Richardson, wherever it is that you're from. But my hunch is that parents in every generation value pretty similar things. So if you are a grandparent and your kids are raising kids, maybe you can relate to this as well. First, we care very much about the education of our children. And I know that seems like an obvious point, but how that shows up is that we tend to search for the best schools in the best school districts that best meet the needs of our specific kids. And we're willing to make sacrifices in order to get our kids into those schools. So that can look like maybe buying the slightly more expensive house than you're really comfortable with in order to get into the right neighborhood. Or it could mean voting for a bond that, yes, is going to raise your taxes, but that you feel like is important for the resources of the schools. In some cases, it could look like sending your kids to private schools if those best meet the needs of your children. And it's not like once we find the best schools and get our kids in the best schools that we're done there because parents spend a whole lot of time volunteering, right? We spend a whole lot of money on fundraisers. Raise your hand if you have more cookie dough in your freezer than you can eat because of your kids or grandkids. We moved some cookie dough from Sherman that some of it's a couple of years old. It feels silly to throw it away, but you see what I mean. And then once we spent that time volunteering and once we spent that money on fundraising, then we spend a fair amount of time monitoring our children's education. So we'll help them with their homework, and we can see all of their work online now. If you're a control freak, it's not a good thing. You can see every assignment that they do, and they've turned it in, how they've done. We go to the schools and meet with their teachers. And you get the point here. And it's all because we are trying to make sure that those best schools that we've spent so much time searching out, that best meet the needs of our children, are the best that they can absolutely be. And because we, rightly, I would say, believe that it's our responsibility as parents to prepare and nurture the minds of our children. I'm not in any way criticizing this. I am, in fact, advocating for it. But the other thing that parents these days spend a lot of time, energy, and money on is activities. And if there's a difference between maybe modern parenting and previous generations, at least as my parents have told me, is we have our kids in more activities than maybe my generation was. So, for example, in our area, there's really a staggering array of activities we can put our kids in. Like we moved from Sherman a few months ago, and we're looking for a soccer league. Well, there was one of those in Sherman. We got a whole bunch of options around here. And so it takes some time to find the best fit. We put our kids as parents in cheer and dance and martial arts and theater and band. In the case of our two kids, we focused really on sports and scouting. They play sports every season of the year except summer, and the only reason they don't play a sport in the summer is because they're too busy at camps for sports and scouts and church. Max, our 12-year-old, has played 21 seasons of soccer, basketball, or baseball. You didn't gasp, so I assume your kids are in the same boat. And his little brother is on that same pace. I honestly have no idea how many hours we have spent as parents on baseball fields and in the stands and at scouting events and camping, and just as significantly, shuttling the kids from one activity to the other. The more kids you have, the more complicated that schedule gets. It requires an engineering degree sometimes to make that schedule work. Thankfully, I'm married to an engineer, and so we are in good hands in our family. It's a lot, is what I'm saying. We spend a lot of time in these activities. And I'm guessing that you're like me on this. I wouldn't trade a minute of any of that because we think it's really important. It's an important investment in the lives of our kids. I'm guessing that there are plenty of parents and grandparents here who are right there with me. All of these activities take significant investments of time and energy and money, all in an important and valuable pursuit of raising well-educated and well-rounded kids that are well-prepared to meet whatever life throws at them whenever it is they leave the nest. I'm assuming it's the case in every generation, but I am absolutely sure that modern parenting is a full-time job. Parents, can I get an amen? Yeah. And so I'm fascinated by this glimpse that the Gospels give us of the childhood of Jesus. As I said, there's only one in the Gospels. There's only one glimpse that we get in the Gospels, and it's here from Luke. And I'm fascinated about this because given what we know about Jesus, we can assume that Mary and Joseph must have done something right. He turned out okay. And the key seems to have been, according to Luke, that Mary and Joseph raised their son immersed in the context of their faith tradition. Luke tells us that at every opportunity, they did what their faith tradition recommends. So they had Jesus circumcised at 8 days old according to the law of Moses. They presented him in the temple at 40 days old according to the law of Moses. After his birth in Bethlehem, they didn't go right home to Nazareth. It was, quote, we read this a minute ago, only when they had finished everything required by the law of the Lord that they returned home to Nazareth. And every year, Luke tells us that the family traveled to Jerusalem from Nazareth to celebrate the Passover, as they did the year that Jesus turned 12. What we learn from this glimpse of Jesus' childhood is that Mary and Joseph focused their efforts to shape the mind and character of their son around their community of faith. And what we know, of course, is that their investment in Jesus was effective. All right, so let's read some more of this. He's 12 years old. They're in Jerusalem for the Passover, like they always do. And now, verse 43. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this?" I promise you this is the edited version of what Mary said to Jesus. "Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" That's what the translation there says, in my Father's house. Literally in Greek it says, "Did you not know that I must be among the things of my Father?" Which I think is interesting. But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. Amen. So Nazareth is only about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. Whitney and I were there about a year and a half ago with our church. And it's a relatively easy bus ride. We were on a charter bus that had a bathroom and snacks and all that, so it was not a bad ride at all. But in the first century, it would have been a significant journey. It would have taken several days to get there along roads that were neither comfortable nor necessarily safe. And so God's faithful would make that journey in groups. So Mary and Joseph and their son would have made this annual pilgrimage with family and friends from Nazareth, all people who shared the same values that they did. They were fellow travelers on the road from Nazareth to Jerusalem. And we should remember the fact that 12 years old in the first century is not the same as 12 years old now, of course. Jesus was not what we would call a tween. In fact, he was just a year away from what was considered the age of maturity in his Jewish tradition. And so we should give his parents some grace that they did not realize that he was not with them for a while. Nobody had to call CPS because he wasn't there, although that would happen today for sure. And only when they did realize that he wasn't with them, they go looking for him. And like any worried parent, they searched for him high and low, to quote his mother, in great anxiety. And when they found him, once they had gotten past that anxiety, I personally can't help but think that they realized in that moment that all the time they had spent in the synagogue and all those trips they had taken to Jerusalem for the Passover, all of that effort and investment had to have been worth it. Because Luke makes it clear that Jesus is what we would call today a church kid. He knows where he belongs. He's attentive to what's being taught. He knows his stuff. And the detail that I love the most about this story is that Jesus is confused that his parents would look for him anywhere other than the temple. He essentially says, "Mom, where did you think I would be? This is who you've raised me to be." And once she got past her anxiety and most certainly her annoyance that her son could be so precocious, Luke tells us that she treasured all these things in her heart. It's the same phrase Luke uses as on the night of his birth, when Mary treasured all these things in her heart. As well she should have, because as I said, Mary and Joseph clearly did something right. I read this story as nothing but a parenting win. If your kid's lost and you find them in church, it's okay. That's okay. And I think this is the perfect text for us on back to school, back to church Sunday, because it reminds us of the importance of being raised in a community of faith, the importance of being formed in the context of a family of faith. Now, if you're here this morning or if you're watching the service online, you're no doubt already inclined to consider the church to be important in some way, and that's a wonderful starting point. But I want to push us on this point a bit. To me, there are three important components of discipleship. One is weekly worship. Now again, you're here this morning, and so I don't need to belabor this point other than to say that being in the worshiping community, with the worshiping community every week, unless we're sick or out of town or somehow physically unable to do so, that's a cornerstone of discipleship. From the day that we're born until the day we go on to glory, weekly worship gives us an indispensable pattern and rhythm of the life of faith. I love on Back to School Sunday how many kids are in worship with their parents. That's really important. It was important to Mary and Joseph, so it should probably be important to us too. A second important essential component of discipleship is service to others. Now, this is a congregation that takes very seriously service to others. It's one of the things that Whitney and I were most excited about when we found out we would be moving here. We have an entire ministry department, an entire ministry area called Serving Others, which I love. If you're not yet serving others in some way, Jana Gramone is our director of Serving Others Ministry, and she would love to talk to you about that. That is a different sermon for another day, though. Because the third component of discipleship is the one we're focusing on this morning, and that's intentional faith development. And what that means in a Christian context is participating in a small group of some kind. Now, specifically this morning, we're celebrating our kids, children and youth, but I am going to come back to the adults in just a minute. We believe that every child and youth in our congregation should belong to a Sunday school class, learning the faith in a community of their peers. Because the development of their spirituality is every bit as important as the development of their minds and their characters, and because our faith has something important to contribute to their minds and their characters as well. As parents, we spend a lot of time, rightfully so, searching for the right schools and the right activities for our kids. As members of this congregation, we don't have to spend any time searching for the right place to teach them the faith. We've been here since July 1st, and both of my boys have gotten involved in children's and youth ministries, and let me tell you, we're in good hands. I'm looking at Meredith, who's our children's director. She'll be up here shortly you're our family ministries director, but also you do children, and she'll be up here shortly to help us bless the backpacks. Pastor Stephanie is our youth minister. We have incredible staff and volunteers in our children's and youth ministries, and I've been in a few churches in my life, and I just have to tell you how fortunate we are with the ministries that we have here. And I hope that every one of us parents, every one of us grandparents, make sure that our kids are as plugged into those ministries as they can be. All right, we're going to finish our reading right now. It's just going to be one verse, so I'm going to read it from the screen instead of opening up the Bible. So we've gotten this story of Jesus when he's 12. We've heard that he's gone back to Nazareth, and this is all we're going to hear about Jesus from that moment when he's 12 until he's baptized when he's 30. The very next verse in Luke's gospel is going to be the beginning of the story of Jesus' baptism. So what we hear about those intervening 18 years is that Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. And it may seem strange that that's all we have about Jesus for those 18 years. But it seems to me that that's enough, because that's what we all desire for the people we love, right? To grow in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. When our boys graduate from college and go off and get married, if that's what we can say about them, we've done our jobs. Raising our kids in church is about the care and formation of their spirituality, which is every bit as essential a responsibility of parenthood as forming their minds and their characters. And it's not going to surprise you to hear that I actually think it's our first responsibility as parents above all the others, because their spirituality will inform their education. It'll inform how they show up on the soccer field or in cheer competition. But of course, it's not just our kids' souls that need formation and care, right? I read an article this week that reinforces something I've heard Don talk quite a bit about and write quite a bit about. So you're probably familiar with this concept. You probably heard it from him before. You may have experienced it yourself. We've got an epidemic in our culture of isolation and loneliness. And it shows up in a lot of ways, some of them quite terrible, as the recent news shows. But believe it or not, it's millennials. According to this article I read, it's millennials, the young parents who are working so hard to be the best parents they can be, who often suffer the most. Now maybe this is your experience, maybe you can relate to it, but this recent poll found that 30% of millennials, so 3 in 10 millennials, say they always or often feel lonely. 27% of millennials say they have no close friends. And an astonishing 22% of millennials say they have no friends at all. Now, isolation and loneliness are an issue across generations in our culture, for sure, but those numbers are the highest by far of any generation, according to this poll. And I have to wonder that if the generation that in my experience spends so much time searching on behalf of their kids, so much time searching for how to be the best parents they can be, how to get their kids to the best schools, what are the best sports opportunities, what are the best dance studios, what are the best ways to prepare our kids for college, and. I wonder if sometimes in all that searching on behalf of others, we lose sight of the fact that every one of us is searching ultimately for meaning and for purpose and for community and for a sense of belonging. And those things, meaning and purpose and community and a sense of belonging, that's what the church is all about. That's our expertise. That's what we do. Christ Church Universal and Christ United Methodist Church in Plano, Texas. That's what we're all about. And so as the kids are heading back to school, I think it's a great time for a reset for us all. Whether or not we have kids in our lives, it's a great time for us to get back to church. Yes, to attend weekly worship with our families, which is the cornerstone of discipleship, and yes, to serve others in some way, because we believe that's the way we demonstrate our love for God, is to demonstrate our love for others, but also to care for our own intentional faith development, because it's within the context of a small group of like-minded fellow travelers that we truly find our deeper connections. It's in smaller groups that we discover friends in the faith, the friends who are going to be there when life is awesome and when life is at its hardest. It's in these smaller groups that we develop a sense of belonging in an all too fragmented and isolated world. And the good news is, here at Christ United, there are lots of options for that. We've got 22 Sunday school classes for adults on Sunday mornings. But if Sunday school doesn't work for you, we have midweek Bible studies and book studies, and some of those are just for women or just for men. Some of those are open for everybody. It could be that the Holy Spirit has placed on your heart to start some as yet unformed group to meet a need. If you have that on your heart, I promise you, we are happy to help you out with that. There are plenty of ways to connect. And now is the perfect time, both to reconnect if we've been out of the habit over the summer, or to connect for the first time if we haven't already, because 2,000 years of Christian tradition and 1,000 years of our faith tradition before that prove to us that those kind of connections are good for our soul. So past couple weeks we were on vacation. This is an annual tradition for our family. We've been doing it for 20 years now. We get together with Whitney's mom and her brothers and their kids. The group has grown over the years, obviously. All 6 of the cousins get along great, which makes it easier. And every year we go away for a week. And sometimes it's the beach, sometimes it's other adventures. We have great food, we connect. It's really a highlight of the year for us. And this year we had to fly to where we were going. And I was reminded, as we prepared to take off, of something that I think is a great metaphor for parenthood, but not just for parenthood, for life. And I'm sure you've heard it before, but it was a good reminder for me, so I'm going to share it with you this morning. It's in that video that they show before you take off, where they show you how to buckle your seat belt. Most of us know how to do that, so most of us ignore that video. But the safety experts say that when there's a loss of cabin pressure, the airbags deploy from the ceiling. And if you're traveling with kids, what do they tell you to do? Yeah, you got to put yours on first, right? And every parent knows that is like contrary to every fiber of your being, to take care of yourself first before you take care of the kids, right? I mean, you're supposed to take care of the babies. But the safety experts know that we're no good to our kids. We're no good to anybody, in fact. If we're passed out from lack of oxygen, even if they've got their oxygen mask safely affixed. And so the safety experts say, parents, doesn't feel natural, but take care of yourself. I think that's a good word on Back to School Sunday. So friends, my prayer this morning is that our children will truly be blessed by the results of all the searching that we do on their behalf. They are blissfully unaware of all the work we do on their behalf, and I so hope that they're blessed by everything we've done for them. But I also pray that God would grant each of us the wisdom to realize that our own souls need the care and nurture that we find in this place. May it be so. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.